Excellent. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Chapman, and welcome to the inaugural quarterly event of the Historical Games Network, of which we hope there will be many, many more to come. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your attendance, and that's what makes the work that goes into this worthwhile. It's been a long road for us getting this up and running, but we're really glad that so many of you seem to be enjoying the content on the website, and we can't wait to show you some of the stuff that we have coming up in the future. I have to mention before we go on that the Historical Games Network has been made possible by funding from InGame, which stands for Innovation for Games and Media Enterprise, and is an £11.5 million research and development centre based in the heart of Dundee, the heart of the Dundee Videos Games cluster. It's led by Abertay University in partnership with the University of Dundee, the University of St Andrews, and local and international industry partners. So InGame develops innovative research and development support services to games companies in the city and beyond, and is part of the Creative Industries Cluster Programme funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. We also receive significant funding from the Scottish Funding Council, so that's the funding that's allowed us to sort of go ahead with this new initiative that we have. For those of you that don't know them, I also have to introduce you to Esther Wright, Nick Webber, and Ian Donald, who are the other conveners of the Historical Games Network and whose hard work has made all this possible. So without further ado, let's get to it. Today we have an hour-and-a-half discussion panel featuring 3 guests. As with all our events, we aim to bring together stakeholders from the different areas invested in historical games, game development, academia, and heritage. And the idea today is for me to offer some questions for our guests to discuss. And then we will open up the virtual floor to some questions from our audience. You can, of course, ask questions over video if you like, but you're also free to type in questions into the chat if you prefer, and we'll choose some of these to read out. So who are our guests today? So we have Ylva Grufsted, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Aalto University and a guest researcher at the University of Helsinki, who concentrates on the interplays of history and games design. She obtained her doctoral degree at the University of Helsinki in 2020 with a research project on the game design and design practices of counterfactual history in digital strategy games. We also have Javier Rayon, who is the writer and director of Dreams of Darkness, a forthcoming Lovecraft and Aztecs video game for PC. Javier founded his game startup, studied his BA in games design, and consults with historians and archaeologists so their findings and questions resound with the general public. We also have John Glancy, who is the executive producer for schools and families at Imperial War Museums, where he manages a national programme that covers the Imperial War Museum's 5 branches and online presence. John also has a background in theatre, having worked as an actor, director and producer in the past. And he and his team are currently developing a new Holocaust learning programme in collaboration with a leading digital studio and Olivier award-winning dramaturge. Okay. So yeah, without further ado, we'll get started on some of the questions for our guests. So we'll jump in with a big question, I think, but it's a sort of necessary one to sort of get the ball rolling. I think it's important to sort of ask what your personal definitions of historical truth are. Is historical truth for you just about the literal recreation of the past and alignment with historical evidence, or are there forms of truth that these kind of definitions might exclude? And maybe we could ask Ylva to answer that question first this time around.
Thank you, Adam. So let's begin with the trickiest question of them all. Well, I suppose I can start from the perspective of counterfactuals in a way. I guess it sounds maybe a little bit backwards, but I find it interesting because you can sort of backtrack from how you understand counterfactuals towards how you might understand historical truth. Because in my work, at least, it's been sort of beneficial to do that in order to sort of, because it allows you to see people's understanding of certain historical events as truth-based or authentic, also based on whether or not they fit into certain counterfactuals and alternative outcomes. So basically the way that we see counterfactuals and alternative histories play out tells us a lot about the way people who've made the games, but also the players of the games, and if we're talking about games specifically, how they understand the sort of the essence of what that specific event, for example, is. So I would say that there is a historical baseline when we talk about historical truth that has to do with method, which is also the fundament of my work, which is that I sort of imagine that, well, there's at least one definition of history that is based on, you know, if a scientific method has been used, then that tells us it's like that somehow defines the baseline for historical truth. So I imagine then that we could maybe think similarly about the way game designers and game developers work, that if we understand their method, then maybe that will bring us close to something that resembles their historical truth, if you will, and at least we can then juxtapose the two and see what happens in that interplay. So I guess the answer to your question is, I do believe there's a difference. Whether or not there is an essential truth, I think we will not be able to answer today fully, but yeah.
So from your point of view, you kind of see we need to sort of look at the community of practice, if you like, in games development and the kind of processes that people go through, and sort of to understand the epistemologies going into kind of development.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Thank you. Maybe on that note, then we could turn to Javier, and he could tell us a little bit about his perspective on historical truth.
Absolutely, Adam. In that sense, I believe it's very useful to first understand what Ylva wrote even on your publication, because at first glance, as a game developer, I didn't understand what counterfactuals mean. So after you described, Ylva, that it is the what-if scenarios, now that resonates with all players. I think it's very important to first wonder what the public perceives as truth in history, because that affects what scenarios would be interesting to explore in these what-ifs possibilities that games allow. So naturally, they, as a general public, do not necessarily get the nuance of, well, we can't necessarily know what happened, the one true version of events. We have to begin with that. They believe that what they know could possibly be the actual version of events. We have to start with that. Naturally, every author, every game developer will have a bias about it. I have my own view of the events that happened. So I believe the historical truth that games can show is naturally, first, the bias of ourselves developers, our own view. Many colleagues, it's sad to confess, do not necessarily get the advice of historians. So that is the account of events that will be depicted in the game. Next, some titles are more about open worlds, let's say Assassin's Creed, that is one of the more successful historical games. So the systems will determine what account of events you'll see. Perhaps you will see how big some of the cities were, and they will convey with some realism how Paris was or the different cities. In our case, for example, that we believe, as John in his article described, that the stories are what resonates more with people, not necessarily the big heroes that many people imagine, because there's a lot of colonialism bias, at least with us, with the Aztecs, with the Mexica, but the everyday man, if we explore their stories, we have the advantage of, first, since people don't necessarily know these not big heroes, we have more creative freedom in order to depict very interesting themes. And in our case, those themes are first determined by what you historians have found. In our case, for example, we question the Aztecs are supposedly these bloodthirsty people. And in order to question that, we don't grab the Aztec emperor or the big conqueror from the Spanish, but we grab people in between who can have this more nuanced version of events. And because we're using a story-driven game, since our title is story-driven, we don't necessarily have to depict what many of my colleagues usually do, and that is combat or strategy that projects to them some version of the events. Instead, since it's story-driven, we can explore the nuance and in that way question, hey, maybe the Aztecs were not necessarily these bloodthirsty individuals. I believe that can happen with many other civilizations if ourselves developers get the nuance of historians.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a few really interesting points there, particularly sort of talking about the way that game structure, of course, affects the kind of history that is produced. You know, it's a hugely important thing. And also the point you had about uncertainty as well, you know, that there's very rarely, I mean, in all historical media, uncertainty is rarely displayed when we know we don't know something about the past. But games present a great opportunity for that, actually, because they're, you know, a medium defined by uncertainty. You both sort of talk about the kind of interacting with popular memory, if you like. You know, it's not just like what is true about the past, but what is believed to be true, and how do we interact with that? And that sort of, I think, brings us nicely to John, who obviously works very much with popular perceptions of the past. So maybe you could tell us a bit about your ideas about historical truth.
Yeah, hello everybody. I think in some ways, and it's really interesting to hear the games developer side, how they would perceive this concept of historical truth. I think there's a couple of things that need to be acknowledged when you answer a question like this. First thing, that history is fundamentally a construct. Javier, you mentioned that idea about this kind of colonial narrative, which is throughout that, you know, history is written by the victors, which is why we see a very kind of European-centric history in global terms. So you're kind of operating within this kind of world of bias to start with. So how I would sort of say where the sort of nub of truth within history is it's quite simple, really. It's empathy. So it's this kind of idea of history in terms of telling truth, historical truth. What you're actually doing is it's an exercise in human empathy. Is you're understanding that you're talking about human beings in situations. Now, sometimes with the case of my work, those situations involve sometimes people dying, some people dying violently. And that in itself, you have to exercise empathy in order to deal with that sensitively. But it kind of works across in all histories. You're talking about human beings that had lives, that had loved ones, that, you know, might have enjoyed football and all that kind of thing. And it's acknowledging that background and acknowledging that that moment in history you may be talking about was 10 minutes in their, you know, 20 years that they spent on this earth. So it's acknowledging them within the round. So yeah, I kind of see historical truth as telling the truth about the people and telling their story with empathy. And the minute that you do that with empathy and understanding of them in a broadest sense, it kind of takes away some of that intrinsic bias, because you are talking to that person as, you're not talking about that person simply as a soldier, or that person as a victim, or that person as a perpetrator, or that person as a Aztec warrior. What you're actually talking about them is a human being that lived on planet Earth within a society, and this is the life that they lived.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So it's sort of, it's about trying to find the sort of universal connection between human stories as well, and the things that sort of don't change. And I think that's a really good topic to bring up in relation to games as well, because, you know, obviously at the local level, you know, games can be incredibly empathic. They can ask us to act as, you know, particular actors, but then of course you get this sort of macro viewpoint in a lot of games as well, where, you know, the human suffering becomes a tick in a mechanic. You know, it becomes quantifiable and yeah, it becomes reducible to, you know, just a series of numbers. And of course those games have advantages as well, but it's definitely a sort of weakness of them as well. Okay, so I think we'll turn to the sort of second question now. And I think we've sort of started to talk about this anyway, but I think it's worth sort of being explicit about it. So what is the role of historical truth in the present? What socio-cultural functions does historical truth serve? Why does this matter? You know, why is this worth discussing? And in particular, do games or play or interactive kind of forms of history have a particular role in this? And if so, what is that? Maybe we could go to Javier first on this one.
Sure, Adam. It was a pleasure when you originally wrote your problem statement, because history is super relevant today in our world beyond just games, and games are not using to the full potential the opportunity that we have as the main way many people get to know different historical contexts. I see that specifically, for example, I can talk about the case of Mexico. Many people fortunately know the Aztecs. It was the Mexica, the Aztecs were one of the civilizations here. There are others that are not as popular, but they are relevant because, for one, there is not one movie or video game that depicts them properly. We have Age of Empires, we have a few out there from Hollywood that emphasize, as I mentioned, the bloodthirsty aspect. But more importantly, it even moves the political struggle, the real political struggle here in our country. And they make use of the very limited accessibility of getting to know the Aztecs that we have here. The president of Mexico, López Obrador, just said that this year we're celebrating 200 years of the foundation of the Aztec capital. And historians and archaeologists were like, what? That is not true. I mean, naturally, archaeologists say, well, most of our city is built on top of the capital. The Spanish destroyed our documents, destroyed so many things. But what they have found is that apparently it was founded in 1325. So they are changing, the president is changing the date so that now that we're in elections, he can have another point. He can say, we're happy now, even if we have so many other problems, and we're even going to change the name of Mexico City to the name that we had with the Aztecs, that is Tenochtitlan. So it's very interesting that the public is having so many different reactions, since many of them don't know the Aztecs, as I mentioned, because there are no movies. There are naturally books, there are very well-researched books, but they are not as accessible to the general public, since they don't have movies, since they don't have games, since entertainment has not explored this enough. They are believing what the president is saying, and they are apparently going to vote for his party. In contrast, fortunately, archaeologists and historians here in Mexico are coming out for the very first time and questioning, you can't change history in order to move your political agenda. In this point, for the first time, they are questioning, and they are using something that sadly is not very sexy. They're just showing documents, they're comparing different things. With our players, I am very happy that I can go to the ruins that still exist and show to them, maybe I can show it if it's relevant for the audience. Hey, this is what remains, and this is how we try to understand the year of the foundation of the city. As you can see, there is no one Aztec written, hey, this is the year when it was built. So no, don't believe what the president is saying, because that can happen in so many other places, like it happened with the US, that the political players, the current political players, will tell a version of events in order to promote their own narrative. So fortunately, with games, if developers want to, we can communicate a bit more what historians are finding, what archaeologists are finding. Sadly, naturally, many developers stay away from this, especially in the English-speaking world. They are very used to, oh, don't be political. That is, I believe, an advantage of being Mexican. We don't care. We're used to, well, the president and games are so separated that he doesn't even know that we exist. So we can say whatever we want without any worry.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. That's a really good example. And I think what we sort of hit on there is, we might be able to argue about truth and, the subjectivities of narratives about the past, but there are facts about the past that, we can't just change willy-nilly, and that has to be the baseline. That's the thing that stops us spiraling into a sort of meaningless, relativism. Yeah, maybe we could move to John, and you could sort of tell us about, the importance of historical truth. What are the stakes today? And, what role does interactive history have in this?
Yeah, so I think we're in a very interesting time, and I think there are multiple factors within that. Is one, we're seeing a massive rise in misinformation and counterfacts. We're also kind of suffering almost as a byproduct of that. As we sit here in 2021, we are the most informed sector of human civilization that's ever existed. We literally have the entire world's knowledge at our fingertips, and we have the entire world's history at our fingertips, which in some ways is wonderful. It means that we can learn and we can look at things that we wouldn't have been able to do a couple of 100 years ago. But in some ways that means that there is so much information and so much overload that becomes really tricky for us to edit. And that's where, especially in history, especially in difficult history, we kind of fall into tropes of misconceptions and myth, because it's easier for us to process it in our brains. But I mean, fundamentally, all this is it's an engagement model. History has always existed, okay? So history has always existed, but we've had ways that we communicate it to other people as we've gone through civilization. So, you know, we've started with, you know, oral history around the campfire, which then transitioned into cave paintings and the Egyptians making monuments and hieroglyphs, which transitioned into the written word, which had transitioned into film, which has transitioned now into the kind of the pointy end of the wedge, as it were, which is this idea of interactive media. So it is gaming. So we're in a really interesting position, I think, especially your sector as a game sector, is that actually, in terms of the way that we tell history as an engagement model, you could argue that play, and this level of interactivity is actually at the precipice of being the dominant medium in which we tell history. Because in many ways, you know, it is moving towards being the dominant medium within culture. You know, if we then talk about, you know, I'm by far not a gaming expert, but what I can see as an outsider of going for an industry which has really existed for what, 40 years, to be where it is now, and the fact that you have games that are like Oscar-winning worthy out there, and you have games which are incredibly real, that you can interact with multiple things in multiple places, that we're in a very interesting precipice, which is why I'm very interested in the medium as history, or to use with history, because I see it as that way to engage. Now, the minute you start to use that correctly and you root that on truth, and I think Abby said, yeah, about this idea of games developers not necessarily engaging with historians. Well, actually, that's a two-way street. Historians don't always engage with game makers either. Okay, so that's the kind of wall that needs to be broken down, because the skill bases of those two pieces of people in society actually together could create something really, really important. Because what you're going to have is you're going to have this concept of historical authority, this concept of historical truth, of someone who is, you know, pushed forward historical pedagogy, has done the research, has read the books, has written the papers, and is absolutely an expert in that particular period in history. And what you have on the other side is you have a communications expert, which is that games model. You have someone who can put something with zeros and ones into a machine and create something that will engage somebody, that will hold someone's attention for however many hours, okay? So you put those two things together, you've got something really special. I think where the point that we're at just now is, we're in that fork in the road where you have one sector doing its thing and another sector doing its thing. And there's lots of bits of cross-pollination that are happening. Some of it are very good. Some of it's not necessarily that good, which annoys one of those sectors. Whereas actually, if we work together, we could do something really good. So yeah, I think it's we're certainly sitting in exciting times, and I think that there's conversations that need to be had between my sector and your sector in order to move that forward and create some fantastic work, which will be true and engaging, which is that rarefied atmosphere that we all strive to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good point. You know, we sort of have these experts on historical content and these experts on game form, and for them to learn to communicate with each other is, of course, you know, something that's going to take a long time, as it has been with the film industry and historical experts. And of course, there's all sorts of horror stories still there. You know, it doesn't always go to plan. But Ylva, I think you looked at this a little bit in your research as well, the role of historical advisors and their role as kind of expertise in games development. So maybe you could say something about that as well.
Yeah, certainly. First of all, I just wanted to sort of say that I agree with most things that have already been said, especially what John said about, you know, this sort of two fields that never really intersect and never really communicate on the same level. I had a student said something that was very astute. We were talking about whether or not game developers are historians, and their rhetorical question was, you know, but but then can historians be game designers, which I thought was very good to sort of capture that disconnect that is currently there. Very impressed with that. But yeah, so another thing I also wanted to, that I was just, while I still have it in my mind, so we're talking a lot about sort of games as artifacts, as products, but I also want to sort of include game culture in this, because I think there's a lot there going on, because game products can be very disparate, they can be very different depending on which game you're looking at, and we're looking at thousands of games that have history in them, and they do it quite differently if we just start comparing them individually to one another. Of course, there are also a lot of repetition and a lot of similarities, but another thing that I think a lot of games have in common is that they're surrounded by gaming culture, which also has its own history, and we can sort of trace a lot of this repetition and a lot of these similarities to sort of tone setting or trend setting games from the 19s, for example. If we're talking about digital games, there are a few titles that, you know, sort of set the tone for everything that's come since, more or less, or in a specific way, which I think is also something that needs to be included in this discussion, because it can also tell us a lot about us as researchers, about, you know, how history is sort of being perceived and what the industry actually caters to, or what they believe that they are catering to. And, you know, sometimes that's something that the developers know a lot better than we do, and sometimes, as historians, that is, and sometimes it might actually be the other way around, because we have some insight into this that you've been talking about, Adam, you know, about popular history and how historical culture and consciousness grows and exists and reproduces itself or not, or, you know, finds its way into politics. And yes, like a lot of this is also, of course, taken from my work with developers, which is, I've been looking specifically at Paradox Development Studio. So most of the games that I'm talking about in my work so far have been these digital strategy games that have a very long history. First of all, they're IPs that have been around for a really long time, that have been iterated on for almost 20 years, actually more than that in some cases. Yeah, closer to 30, I would say at this point. And that studio has a very specific way of framing the work that they do, also in terms of expertise, because they, one example of this is that they find a lot of their expertise among their beta testers, for example, who are players of the games that volunteer their time to do content creation, for example. So there's some almost tautological logic to that, where the players of the games have sort of become interested and found the history in those games particularly interesting, and then they go to Paradox and say, hey, I can help you develop these games, and then they begin to create the content for the next iteration of the game, and it becomes this sort of almost like a closed system, if you will. There are details, of course, that sort of break this logic up a little bit in terms of how they source their materials and what books and what source material they use and how it's being discussed and sort of chewed within the community there, that speaks to an understanding of expertise as something that comes from books, for example, or something that comes specifically from historians, which is interesting because that in this particular case, that means that there is this sense of authority by historians' authority, if you will, within the developers community as well, which I think is another reason that this dichotomy sort of exists. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think it's really good that, you know, work such as yours has started to move us towards looking at games culture now, you know, because for so long we've sort of treated games, you know, in my own work for a long time, I treated games as a sort of a formal problem first, and then sort of later on moved to looking at games culture with work on the limits and play and stuff. But it's really interesting, this idea of authority, because you see the same thing in reenactment communities, where there's new negotiations of how authority exists because the traditional structures kind of break down. And in reenactment communities, that generally goes to sort of an extremity, you know, like whoever suffers the most, for example, you know, is the most authoritarian on the past. Yeah, that's really good. It also reminds me of what you said about the way these game series have just repeated the same thing for so many years. You know, it gets locked into a cycle. With the original Medal of Honor, I know Steven Spielberg worked on that and he wanted the same color tone as with the film. And it seems to me that sort of gray and green, that brown kind of color tone, the very pale, has sort of come to signal authenticity in video games. You know, you see it in even properties like Gears of War, where obviously it's not authentic, it's sci-fi, but still you see these recycled tropes. It really put me in mind of that. Okay, so let's go for a potentially controversial question. Are there particular truths which, in your view, games can't talk about? And we could extend that to not just games can't talk about, but truths that we can't play with. For example, I have written a bit with Jonathan Duth on the sort of exclusion of the Holocaust, for example, from video games. And of course, this slavery is something that we don't see very often. But I think we can expand that to sort of interactive history, and also include the sort of museum and heritage kind of perspective. Are there certain things that you won't touch in that context as well? So maybe we could hear your answer first, John.
Yeah, good question. No, I don't think. I'm trying to be more eloquent than that. It comes into, I guess, it comes into this idea of unconscious bias. Okay, so what is a game? So a game, now it's interesting. I was speaking at something not that long ago, which was not about gaming, but it was about the Holocaust. So obviously, at the moment, Holocaust learning comes under my portfolio. I'm by far I'm not a Holocaust expert. I'm a generalist in my role, but it is something I have to be very mindful of in terms of the content. And somebody on that panel, very respected, very kind of accomplished person, went, problem with games is they're frivolous. Okay? Now, there's an argument for that. It comes into this idea of what is a game. Well, it's someone you sit in your bedroom and you shoot aliens and you have a great time, and I'm sure everybody on this call enjoys doing that. Great. But is that the case? Are games frivolous? Or have we just kind of built this unconscious bias into us that games are frivolous, books are like authentic, and film is kind of in between? So it's like culture a spectrum. You know what I mean? It's like you've got kind of good culture and bad culture. And I don't believe that at all. I think what they have is you have culture that every single aspect of culture, whether it's a novel, whether it's a film, whether it's a computer game, whether it's a piece of visual art, it all has to have integrity, and it all can't lie in the grand scheme of things. So if you take the Holocaust, for instance, now at the moment I'm working with a leading digital studio, Friday Sunday, and dramaturg Steph Smith to create what essentially is a game about the Holocaust. It is a digital app that will take learners, in this case Key Stage 3 and 4, so kind of early secondary pupils, through our new Holocaust galleries. It's not a game in the sense that you don't score points, you don't have to take part in events, but it's a game in the sense that it has a loop. It has a system. It asks you questions. You have to make choices. You have agency throughout that to take one path or another path. But fundamentally, what it's designed to do is to inform you about the courses, causes, and consequences of the Holocaust, and ask you questions throughout that. Now, that, in me, is an entirely appropriate way to deal with that history. Now, you can apply that to all kinds of, you can talk about the slave trade, you can talk about, imperial history, you can talk about all these other tricky factors in the same way, because fundamentally what you're doing is, by creating a game about that, what you're creating is you're creating a mechanism, a mechanic, in which people are encouraged to ask questions and use their own agency to come to a conclusion. And I think that's fundamentally sound. Also, I think that all the aspects of history should be taken into on their own merits. I know I just contradicted myself by mentioning 3 pieces of difficult history as if they were the same thing. They're nothing alike. They're 3 difficult pieces of history that have no relevance to each other. Okay, so you need to acknowledge it on that. And also, I think that the key thing is understanding that, again, going back to the answer to the last question, this is a model of engagement. It's a way to engage. It is as valid as me writing a book. And in fact, I would say that given some novels about the Holocaust, which I know are taught in schools, the program that I'm developing with lots of really great colleagues is, more credible because it's actually rooted in truth and rooted in collections, rooted in known pedagogy, than, say, a fiction writer who has written a fictional scenario based in a period of time. So, yeah, I think we need to, like, as a sector, heritage, we need to kind of, get over the fact that games aren't just played in basements and involve shooting aliens. And actually, I think the games industry needs to understand that actually you do have something to bring to the party. And it comes back to that question of we need to talk to each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good answer. I think it is a lot to do with sort of cultural perception. I don't see it as a limitation of the form itself so much as how people perceive the form and what they worry about. But maybe you could speak to this a bit more, Hilda?
Yeah, of course. Are there historical truths that game can't talk about? I mean, currently, I guess the answer is yes, but should there be? Absolutely not. I completely agree with everything that John just said, but the format itself is not different, and not any different from writing a book or making a movie, which we know that tends to work. Of course, it can always be problematic because of the subject matter, but that's actually, in my opinion, something that can be more easily accessed by speaking of historical culture, for example, because it does tell us how we assign value to certain things in our today's societies, and how that can also differ, because that's usually, you have contested history, and by studying how this history is being communicated in different spheres, very vague term, but groups of people, nations, or even within families, you can see how these differences point to the value that we tend to ascribe these particular things, and how they're then being used to either maintain some sort of hegemony or trying to break up that hegemony, which of course is a very important aspect of talking about these things, because a lot of the times the things that we tend not to make games about and tend to find more difficult to speak about are atrocities that come with erasure, for example, not Holocaust specifically maybe, but well, yes, actually, I mean, sorry, that came out extremely wrong. Sorry, what I meant to say was that sort of the writing of, there are other histories that have been sort of neglected for a very long time, which leads to erasure in the historical narratives. That's what I meant to say. Which, yeah, so, sorry. Oh, I had, okay. Yeah, so what I meant to say is then, of course, that we can treat games the same way. Games can also be art, and I think this should be treated as an art form. So there is this level of creativity that goes into that discussion as well, which I think was captured very nicely by John in his paper as well, about what license actually does, and how license can be used to sort of to pinpoint the sort of the bits that are necessary to keep, and the bits that give us the freedom, and games, but anything really, to frame the human experience and how that matters, and the empathy of it. I thought that was really well put. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think your sort of point about the sort of cultural context, the different spheres in which these things exist, as well as, there's loads of examples of that in the sort of controversies that surround games as well. I mean, like, if you look at the sort of legalities of displaying the swastika in multiplayer games in Germany, for example, and how often a separate server has to be created, less so now because games are more recognized as legally as an art form there. And also the same thing with the sort of rising sun flag of the Japanese military, which is, not controversial at all here, but very controversial in parts of Asia, for example. So I think it is about context as well. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because obviously there's an economic incentive almost not to engage with these topics for developers, because they are difficult. They might trigger controversy. It might put some people off from buying the game. Of course, it might also encourage people to buy the game. But at the same time, we're getting this kind of whitewashing of history, which is a sort of conclusion that I've sort of written about before, by ignoring these things because we're sort of scared to sort of touch them. And obviously, your game, Javier, will be including difficult topics. You know, colonialism obviously is a very sensitive and, you know, politically relevant topic. So maybe you could sort of speak on this as well.
Absolutely. Getting back first to the question by our audience about maybe what truths shouldn't games depict, I agree entirely with Ilva and John about, as a form, we can naturally explore everything, as do books and movies. However, the real complexity comes with the biases of ourselves as developers. Sadly, there are many developers, many colleagues who suffer from solipsism. That is, they mostly just play games, consume games, their whole life is games, and may not necessarily understand what impact their titles, when they are out in the market, could have with a broader audience. And even worse, they look for controversy, supposedly as a way to foster their sales. So one example of this, tragically, is 6 Days in Fallujah. It is a comic game about the tragedy of how the US Army used white phosphorus and other terrible weapons in the Iraq War. And instead of doing, as John mentions, some licensing in order to depict how terrible this was, what a tragedy this was, to go into the story of maybe the Iraqi or the soldiers, they're going the Call of Duty route. That is, they are championing the violence. Fortunately, while the specialized press is questioning this, is saying, hey, how come you're releasing this game that instead of exploring this with nuance, you're just making Call of Duty, but with a real terrible tragedy, the developers don't necessarily don't care about this kind of reception, because it will create controversy. It will get the game more well known. It will get to people buying it. So I believe that as developers, we have to engage with a broader audience. It is so easy, I believe, for every specialized industry to just engage with your own, since you have so many challenges. You believe that only ourselves will understand each other. But by actually engaging outside of our bubble, we can see, okay, maybe this topic is too controversial. It can be approached. Our art form does have the capability to do it. But well, maybe we have to do something else than just shooting. For example, that's exactly what we're trying to do. It is very weird that Mexicans, since they get the colonial version of events, they want to see Aztecs fighting. That's the main thing that they want to see. And in contrast, Europeans, our European players, are more interested in questioning the colonial version of events. It should be, I believe, the other way around, maybe, I don't know. Still, by engaging with this broader audience is that we can understand what specific audiences want to see, expect to see, and we have to be informed enough in order to question this with taste, I believe.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really good answer. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and obviously one that comes up a lot in games culture, because games seem to provoke controversies. You know, that's what I've focused on in my work, is that why do games provoke controversies more than other sectors, when, as we point out, they are just another art form. You know, there's another mode of expression, another way to engage the past. I think it's a really interesting point where we sort of look at the intersection between sort of politics and cultural perceptions and you know, notions of truth and walking the line between sensitive depictions and, you know, whitewashing is obviously, it can be difficult, but yeah, I think it's an important thing for the games industry to tackle. I think maybe we've got, if people have questions, maybe they could put them in the chat for our speakers. And in the meantime, we will do one more question maybe before we open up for the audience. So, final question, I think we'll go for, how does historical truth function in games or interactive media compared to other historical media? You know, what is different about the way historical truth functions in games? And also, you could maybe point to games that you think deal with this well, you know, existing games that deal with this well, or interactive histories that sort of deal with this well, that have something sort of novel about them, that manage to communicate truths in interesting or engaging ways. So maybe we could start with Ilva again.
Yeah, that's a very good question. How do historical truths work specifically in games compared to other media? Was that it? I don't think we can generalize in terms of, I guess we have to be a little bit specific about what games we're talking about and what sort of design they actually have. Because of course, depending on which, if shooting is the main mechanic, then we're in a very specific genre that deals with truths a little bit in this, facts and figures or numbers and like game type way, talking about if whether or not a gun has the accurate like rate of fire, for example. It seems to be, the level at which historical truth actually is most interesting. Of course, that also translates into gameplay, so it has more of a systemic role to play there as well. But I think a lot of the discussion, like for example, Battlefield 5 is an interesting example always, because when it came out, it was there was a female soldier, for example, that came in as one of the playable characters. Or at least it was announced that way early on in the process, and that just sparked a lot of discussion amongst players who deemed this sort of historically untrue, and completely ignoring a bunch of other things, of course, that were also historically untrue, but also not necessarily taking into consideration, what the framing of this character actually was, and how that sort of could make sense or did make sense. So what I'm trying to say is that in that case, it becomes very detail oriented. It becomes very focused on things that sort of removes this historical backdrop, if you will, that contextualizes everything else that goes on, and also which is actually the fundament for telling these stories as something that has actually happened. I mean, the rate of fire on a specific gun only makes sense in the context of the Second World War, so it's ultimately a story about the Second World War, and that becomes very lost in the discussion surrounding these types of games often, whereas it's a little bit the other way around with the digital strategy games, for example, where historical truth is sort of baked into the actual code of the game, presumably, or at least that's the intention often, in terms of systemic rule sets, the behavior of the AI, which leads and frames the path that the player takes as they play. And of course, is also in that becomes the very building blocks that they play with when they go on counterfactual routes. Interestingly, I find that very often these counterfactual scenarios are actually built up of other historical truths. So in questioning or playing with or problematizing the historical content and systems of the games and the scenarios that they're being presented, players are actually allowed to sort of circle straight back onto other historical events. An example of this is House of Iron 4, for example, where the American National Focus Tree, which is one of these like narrative focus you can take that tells the story of a fascist America during the Second World War, which ultimately ends up with the player reinstating the Confederacy. So the counterfactual, of course, is an alt history, but it's not completely fictional, or it's not sort of taken out of thin air. It's actually tells us a lot about, it's a story about the 1860s to some extent, rather than the 1930s, actually, which I think is, just another way another way that historical truth is sort of the kernel often in the center of many of these games, but of course on different levels. So like you were mentioning earlier also, Adam, about this sort of, that there are certain things that it's very difficult to change because they're sort of set in stone, and we can't really question them because, the Second World War did happen. So that's not something that is technically up for discussion. But in these games, we then see that when that starts to be, that is put into question, then it sort of unveils or reveals a lot of other historical culture as well, and ties into other things that, sees a causality between these different events and so on. So I think it has a very functional role, actually. Again, with the sort of caveat that historical truth, then what is that? But yes, these kernels of truth are often the anchor of a lot of stuff that happens in games, whether it be discussion around games or actual gameplay. I would say.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I think the counterfactuals are such a good way to think about sort of how games function with history, and I think, you know, even when you have these scenarios that, you know, plainly didn't happen, and we can have multiple different scenarios, there's always a bedrock of, if not truth, then argumentation, you know, that a game maintains an internal logic according to particular historical causality or theory of historical causality. So there is always an embedded truth there, even when the service aesthetic is so different. That's really good. And what you said about material culture as well, you know, this obsession with the look of the past. You know, the weapons are right, and sort of John talked about this in relation to Bravo 2.0 as well. And, you know, we see this not only in the media products, but in the audience's expectations as well. Sean Beaver's in her thesis, when she looks at perceptions of authenticity, it's the material culture that people talk about. It's the clothes. It's the, you know, it's that's what the expectation is of audiences there as well. So maybe there's work to be done on that front as well. So maybe we could turn to John, and you could sort of talk a bit about how you see historical truth working differently through interactive media or games or play. You know, what's the difference here? Yeah.
I think it's an interesting one. It's you know, just to kind of go on the previous point, it is this idea of what games, in my experience, do really, really well is do that level of technical accuracy, which I touch upon. You know, you mentioned I touched upon in my blog post. So, you know, if I play a Call of Duty game and my character is carrying an FN Scar, for instance, which is an assault rifle, for those of you that aren't gun nerds, is this idea of it that will look pixely accurate. Okay, the ammunition is correct. It will, you know, you can see there's a difference with the 7.62 caliber recoil and the 5.56 recoil. So all that kind of accuracy is in there, and there's obviously been a huge amount of emphasis and detail put on that. Yet I can jump off a second floor window and not break both my legs. I can be shot more than once, and if I hide behind the wall for 5 minutes, I'm healthy again. So it comes into that idea of like, so, you know, let's use the Battlefield games as case in point. So Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5. Well, Battlefield 1 I'm not going to talk about because it had like people in suits of armor and things like that in the mountains in Italy, which was ridiculous. But Battlefield 5 is a really good case in point. As you say, the weaponry was accurate. In that case, they had a female resistance fighter, which again is accurate and, you know, good to see in terms of representation within the game. But actually, because the mechanics of the gameplay of, you know, jumping over walls and jumping out of windows and, you know, racing on a set of skis through like Wehrmacht shooting at you and taking hits and all that kind of stuff is so ridiculous that it could be something, you know, the game that I'm playing at the moment is the newest Wolfenstein game, which I'm thoroughly enjoying. But, you know, the actual mechanics of that, one of which is, you know, multiverse, counterfactual. Everyone kind of says to me, oh, Wolfenstein, you won't like that because you know about the war. I mean, it is, I might as well be playing shooting aliens. It is completely ridiculous and very entertaining. But actually, the kind of mechanic difference between those, they're not. Like, one of them is sort of trying to be accurate, as in an American will have an M1 Garand, and a Brit will have a Sten gun. But actually, I'm still doing something utterly ridiculous in terms of the actual gameplay model. So I know they are out there, and I'm not a games aficionado. I know that there are out there. I'm really interested in games that in terms of where they can fit within a historical narrative, any games that allow this idea of critical thinking. And it goes back to my first point about human empathy. So you make a decision about something that has a consequence within the narrative that you're working on. And that narrative, that consequence doesn't necessarily have to be accurate, but the choice itself has to be accurate. So I think that's kind of where gaming can sit, and that's what I think the really exciting thing about gaming is that you have, your history is always going to be right. Your history is always a through line. So what happened is always a through line. So point A to point B, that happened. I think there is an allowance for variance between point A and point B to say that you as a player, you as a consumer, have made a different decision, which has taken you away from point B, as long as we explain what that difference in that graph is. Okay, so because you took the bread and didn't not take the bread. This has happened. And then that goes into this idea of like counterfactual and multiverses, which in itself is really interesting. But yeah, I think that from my own experience, gaming does technical accuracy very, very well, better than most. But needs to understand that if you jump out a second floor window, you are going to break your legs and not be very effective at fighting anybody.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's really interesting, particularly the last point you were saying there about, it needs to explain what's going on. You get this kind of black box in sort of video games. We often don't see what's under the hood, and why things we've done have worked out in particular ways, which has never been a problem for things like board games, for example, because we have to construct the rules between us. But it's also interesting for you to talk about Wolfenstein, and I think that it is absolutely what you say. It's a different kind of selected accuracy, if you like. And one thing I think is really interesting about Wolfenstein is it's one of the only games that actually engages with the Holocaust, even though it's a sort of, it's an alternate event, if you like. It's not the Holocaust. They still engage with the sort of Nazi genocide, and in fairly sensitive and nuanced ways in comparison to games like Call of Duty, which claim to be very accurate and either avoid these things or do it very much as an afterthought. So that's a really good point there. So maybe we could, Javier, you could speak to this idea of how historical truth functions in video games differently, and if there's any particular games you want to highlight that you think do it really well.
Absolutely. Well, as Ilva and John described, there are so many different kinds of games that this is a big topic by itself, but something that all games have in common is agency. While one game can have strategy as the main form of enjoyment, another can be shooting, another can have no action even, they all have an element of agency. So the opportunity for games to depict historical truth, I believe, can be in the sense of empowerment of the player, of the individual, to realize he can change things in some way. Every title will, according to the objective, the mechanics, will explore this empowerment in a different way. One of the titles I've seen that does this in a more, let's say, audacious way, ambitious way, would be Bioshock Infinite. It is a very interesting title because it is AAA. It is action-oriented. It has the accuracy, as John describes, of some of the guns. They are very, very well designed. But it uses its counterfactual structure, the what-if scenario, in a way that I believe empowers us to see, oh my God, we have to be very careful about American exceptionalism. So the game is about, in the early 20th century, a group of Americans say, we want to build paradise on Earth. We won't wait until we possibly die and go to heaven. We want to build that on Earth, and we're going to make use of recent scientific discoveries in order to build a utopia that is flying, a city in the skies. So you go to that city. And it is very impressive that I've had the opportunity of going to the Vatican. Maybe it is the, I don't know, holiest city in Christian views, or the one that has more buildings related to it. Well, I was still far more impressed by what Bioshock Infinite designed in that city. You are in that beautiful place, there's flowers everywhere. However, you can see American exceptionalism getting to the extreme, because you see that, well, it is almost a white supremacist society. And instead of you being another white supremacist hero, the story is catered so that you are seeing the horrors of this utopia. And because of your actions, you have to rescue someone who is locked in this place, Elizabeth, a woman. You slowly get to question, not only as a big thing, but you slowly begin to question, well, the reasons of each of these characters that led them to this place. You can see the builders of this utopia. You get to see those fighting against utopia that are not necessarily just the good guys. They have their own problems. And in that sense, it makes you then question, oh my God, how much of this could be real? Players can then get to Google and see American exceptionalism is a real thing. There are different applications of that. And you get to feel a sense of, I can choose the kind of society that I want to build. maybe, hopefully, I reject that sort of utopia, and maybe I believe that something different could be better.
Thank you for that. That's yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I hope often that games kind of do inspire that kind of feeling, and I love the Bioshock series, so I'm really glad you mentioned that.
It is our main reference, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example of how sometimes by sort of stepping away from the traditional accuracy, if you like, sometimes sort of more important truths can be dealt with, because it allows game developers to step away from the tropes that surround particular history and really sort of engage. And I really like the Bioshock series for that. They don't always achieve what they set out to do, but at least they try. That's a really good example. Okay, so we've got some questions in the chat here. So we've got one here from Alexander, who says, first of all, thank you all for this very interesting discussion. One question I had pertains to the history of historical games. Obviously, games and game design technologies have evolved a lot over the past 50 years, audiovisually, to name one perhaps superficial aspect. But do you think that the way in which history and historical truths are dealt with in games has evolved over time as well? So is it just the technology that's evolving, or is it also the means of engaging the past, the sort of design practices, the sort of ways of making meaning, basically? I think maybe for these, we don't have to do it in any particular order. If someone has something they want to say about it, you can.
Sure. Maybe if you like, I can give some context, because I'm sure that maybe I know a bit of the intricacies in the technology. Okay. So in the beginning, most of games were exploring the technical capabilities of our medium. That's why with the very first game, Space War, we were shooting at things because scientists who originally developed this knew the science in order to make vectors, in order to determine where the target will be, how you can reach that target by shooting. So it was not necessarily with intention of causing empathy or other things. At the very beginning of our industry, it was very technically oriented. What can we do with very limited resources? Naturally, we're not at that point anymore. At the moment, fortunately, our technical possibilities surpass many times what we can do. Right now, the limitation is in two terms: our imagination as developers, and the other is the cost. Making games is extremely expensive, and different studios fight about that. So many of the more popular, well-known titles are AAA titles with publisher deals. So as I described in my contribution to the Historical Games Network, that leads them many times to repetition, to continue doing what consumers are currently consuming in their respective genres. However, there is fortunately also the possibility with going into the specific audiences, niches, that you can do other things that not necessarily have the restraint of cost or creativity, because you're going into very specific audiences that therefore are not as competed. But there, the challenge then is to find the audience. Discovering audiences is currently, for these niches, is currently the biggest challenge for the AA scene or the indie scene. Since we're not marketer experts, this is more of a marketing challenge. And just like right now, we're discussing that historians maybe and developers don't engage as much. This also happens with marketers. Marketers and game studios that are not AAA do not engage sadly enough. So this is currently, I believe, what determines what we explore in our titles.
Do John or Ilva want to say something about it? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, just that very last point that Javier said reminded me. I think one of the things that is changing, of course, is also the involvement of historians in game making, from both, like the initiative on both sides, so to speak. That game developers, I'm currently doing a little bit of research on historians that are sort of working as consultants in the games industry, specifically in the Assassin's Creed context. Well, I guess but this also happens very likely in other areas as well, Paradox as well. And I think that is something that has changed a little bit over time, because as we see these discussions sort of explode often when there is a little bit of controversy around historical facts in games, or whether or not a game does a certain history well or not. We also see developers having to engage with this discussion that we're essentially having here now as well. So, and I think their go-to, and I at least in the work that I've been doing so far, it seems that the go-to is to engage with historians. That doesn't mean necessarily that the language they speak is the same and that they have the same objectives always, but that is something that I think has changed significantly in the last, say, 10, 15 years.
I agree. I think that, yes, I believe that a lot of this is generational as well. And I think that any medium that is used to tell history or anything really is dependent on the key decision makers that can kind of augment that form. So I think there's a really interesting one in terms of the opportunity for games based on where we are in society right now. So I kind of, you know, for those of us that are old enough, here is a depressing thought for you. Basically, as of kind of this year going into next year, we are going to see the first teachers in classrooms who were born in the 21st century. Okay, so it's this sort of idea of we will then have that kind of level of decision within education, which is obviously a fundamental tenet of society, that have always lived within the digital age. So actually, will they be more open to this concept of learning through games? Because, you know, gaming, whilst it's been around for a lot longer, you know, if you kind of look at that, you know, the sort of the graph of, you know, the PlayStation generation where games really became like, wow, this is amazing. They were at the kind of very, very bottom of that. And then it goes into the same in terms of like any sort of like the same applies to historians. So I speak this as, if anybody read the Guardian article this week, I speak to this as a geriatric millennial, which is apparently what I am. You know, I'm on that kind of cusp of I've lived in an analog and a digital world, whereas actually anybody younger than me has only known digital. So they will therefore embrace that within their practice in the way that maybe 10, 15 years ago, where the key decision makers perhaps only lived in that analog age where, you know, the concept of gaming was more niche. So I think that absolutely, as Javier said, the technology is now kind of smarter than us. We've got, you know, comes into screens as well, you know, 8K and 10K screens are being provided, which are essentially higher resolutions than even the best that eyesight in the world can see. So, you know, when do we stop? But it's more about how we as users engage in it and the value that we as users put on the medium.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. Yeah, I definitely think we sort of get back to the notion of games culture as well. You know, that determines the content that's produced, not just the sort of technology and the understanding, I suppose. Okay, so we'll take another question. We've got a question here from Claire Mead that says, so interesting about the female soldier and this debate, since so many did exist, including those who were not documented. Given there is so much unfortunately left to interpretation in terms of routinely erased LGBTQI and feminist histories, how could games become spaces for reinterpreting traditionally underrepresented women and non-binary people histories? And is this potential being limited by a systemic lack of women and members of the LGBTQI community within the games industry? So I don't know who wants to talk about that first.
Yeah.
Javier, you look like you've got something to say.
Yeah, in that sense, I was just having a conversation today with a historian on the topic. Fortunately, there is a demand now in games to depict other protagonists instead of the usual white male. And while fortunately games have done some of this depiction, there, for example, in Tomb Raider, we have a woman who is an adventurer, although she is white. We have Samus Aran from Metroid, but she is white, she's a woman. There's so much we can do today. Unfortunately, that demand, as I was mentioning before, is easier to find for us developers, so that it is economical feasible to satisfy that. Currently, an important challenge is how to do this with taste. As you can imagine, sadly, in the games industry, most of us are men. And what John was describing, many of the decision makers are also sadly men. So many times we'll have men doing these female characters, but with our biases in a very limited way, they're not depicting something interesting. What we're trying to change, I can't change being a male, I mean, that's how I was born, but what we can do, at least in our title, is to get as much information from the experts. Since our protagonist, we chose her being female, not only because, well, women are not represented enough in the foundation of our country, in Mexico. If you read the history of it, it was just white men writing their own adventures because they wanted to get more favors from the king, the Spanish crown. And more importantly, because it also resonates a lot with the mythology of our civilization. With the Mexica, with the Aztecs, women have a better standing that they currently have today. Here, sadly, it is a very male-oriented hierarchy. So how can we do that? I have a picture of our protagonist that maybe at some time we can share with the audience, but we try to find, as John describes, what will cause empathy, because there are so many gaps. Naturally, I cannot represent our protagonist, Isabel Rodriguez, the first nurse in the West, in a historically truthful, completely accurate way. Very little was written about her, as I described. So what we try to do instead is to find what women were living in that time in the 1520s and depicting those struggles. For example, that she was 15 years old, yet already a widow, because sadly, women would get married at 12 years old even, and so many other things, so that they will not be, again, a Tomb Raider or a Samus Aran, where they are fighters, but just in a woman form, but actually depict the real struggles that they have, maybe inventing some of it, having some license, creative license, so that we can see, oh, wow, sadly, these communities had these limitations at the time in these historical times, but also because of that, they also had some very interesting capabilities. For example, women were more informed about healing because it was very usual for them as family, I don't know, the main people in charge of their families to know what caused disease and how to heal them. That was something that happened in medieval Spain. So that is a special capability. That's why she's very valued with our context of Spanish explorers. So I believe that by looking into the findings of historians, we can create characters that are not just gender swaps, but that actually have interesting capabilities that can be explored with agency.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good answer. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of work to be done in the history discipline to sort of uncover these sort of hidden histories as well. But there is, you know, work having been done for the past couple of decades now. So there is stuff out there that the games industry can draw from to sort of engage with these ideas. Did John or Ilva want to comment on that point?
Sure. So it's a really interesting question, and I guess I can talk of it from someone who works with history creatively, and in terms of how I approach that work. You know, as Javier said, I am a straight white man, and I can't change that. What I can acknowledge is the fact that I'm a straight white man with a reasonable amount of influence in my field. And I certainly say that the way to approach this work is, and this is where the challenge is, and it's a challenge that's done by my colleagues, is, okay, so I'm, you know, the typical guy that works in culture. I consider myself, you know, socially liberal, and yes, this is very, very important work, and we need to get these stories out. But also I have zero lived experience, okay? So much of that work, because I am the dominant narrative within that, is me basically augmenting these stories, okay? So it's me telling stories about, you know, protected groups or whatever, okay? And I'm doing so with no lived experience. So actually, in terms of the work, now I've just recently done quite a lot of work on imperial legacy. Is the key thing that I had to say is, actually, I need to step back from this and I need to approach this work simply as an ally. Okay, so I have the influence to give this work a platform, but I do not have the lived experience in which to animate this work in any way, shape, or form. So you then go out and you find the really best female LGBTQI, whoever, you find those people that you want to work with, and then you platform them or give them the help. If they require help, they might not need it, but you give them a platform for them to be able to create that work with a mandate. And that changes things, okay? Rather than, because I think that those stories are out there, those stories need to be told. They either aren't told for, you know, bad reasons, or they're told badly for good reasons, okay? So get the people who can actually tell them for good reasons well, and put them in the room to do it. And I think that's the important thing, as, you know, understanding if you are a decision maker, that you can influence that change. But you can influence that change, but you can't necessarily make that change. That needs to be done by other people.
Thanks for that. Did you want to say something about this, Silva?
I mean, just really quickly, I guess, really great points from both of you. Representation really matters in the design teams in order to, you know, just think about how to accurately or respectfully or even at all depict these groups. And I also think as scholars, we have a lot of if not responsibility, then opportunity to actually also critically study the game industry and how that works. There's a lot of important work currently being done in that area that looks very critically at how, you know, have had the opportunity, because it's a tricky business to study where you don't necessarily have access. It's really tricky. I mean, Wright, for example, is doing really good work based on paratext, for example, that's sort of critically looking at the ways history is being depicted from a sort of industry promotional standpoint. But the minute we also get access to the developers themselves and are able to interview them, for example, or even observe what they're doing, we get a lot of information on also how sort of the under the hood stuff of what happens in the studios, and that's extremely relevant to this specific discussion, I would say. So I would encourage anyone who has an interest in this to engage with that work, and also perhaps to engage in studies yourself, because we need a lot more information on that going forward, because I think we have a role to play as scholars in general have a role to play here as well, staying on top of how representation and power dynamics and stuff like that works in the games industry, because it also affects how the games then work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, you know, part of a broader point that, you know, the more we study production and consumption, the more we'll understand about the texts themselves as well, you know, from both perspectives. And as you mentioned, there's really good work being done, you know, looking at sort of like Emil Hamar's work, looking at sort of the representation of marginalized people and the sort of political economy that allows these representations to exist and stuff like that. So that's really good. We also have a question here from, I'm going to mispronounce your name now, I'm sorry, it's Oded, I think, Oded, who says, how do we deal with competing narratives, national or otherwise, when it comes to historical truth, where someone from a certain nation would see an event, mechanic or story as true, while another one might consider it false or misled? I guess this is something you have to deal with, John, in the Imperial War Museums. Very much so, these sort of competing narratives, and particularly when it's a very sort of nationalized kind of emotive kind of topic. So maybe you could start us off on that one.
Yeah, it's a really hard one, because I suppose to a certain extent is, again, it goes into this idea of bias. There's always an element of bias within the story. So, you know, where we approach is that we approach conflict in global terms. So it's that kind of idea of, we will see ourselves as a social history museum, and we talk about the courses, causes and consequences of conflict, not the courses, causes and consequences of the British Army or one of the other service branches. So we try and tell as rounded the story as possible. There are challenges within that where there are absolutely disputed histories, especially around conflict, of like, we're not going to teach this. I'm not going to talk about various parts of the world where this is happening right now, but I'm sure everybody is aware that it is being talked about significantly in parts of the world right now. So I guess it is, the challenge in that is, it comes into this idea of research and history and taking a broad narrative. So not just looking at something from a European-centric point of view or a single nationality point of view, is actually understanding and wherever possible finding that kind of through line, as it were. This is where things like language becomes really important. So it's this idea of, you know, referring to every military person in the German Wehrmacht as a Nazi. That is, there are places that will do that, and it is kind of a shorthand, but is that accurate? No. Well, we will refer to the Wehrmacht, you'll refer to the SS, you'll be as specific as possible. Same idea when you talk about kind of imperial legacies, we talk about this empire experience. Well, does that mean that someone from Bangladesh and someone from Trinidad is the same? No, they're not. You just need to be specific. So you're talking about someone from Trinidad, and you're talking from someone from Bangladesh, or you're talking from someone from Australia or someone from South Africa. So you can kind of get around that by just being as specific as possible. So if some, one nation thinks one thing, you can talk about that nation. You can talk about that nation thinking about one thing. I think I saw something in the comments, actually. It's a really interesting one, is that where you see this in a kind of softer form is about the concept of remembrance. So how we remember war dead. Now, it's really, really interesting that, in Britain, the kind of idea of Britain is this, there's a 2-minute silence on the 11th of November, people wear poppies. That is that British narrative that works for Britain, and that's how Britain marks remembrance, but actually it's different wherever you go across the world, and you need to reflect on all of these things. It's that idea of, in the Oceanian continent is, as I understand it, Anzac Day in Australia is kind of like, a bank holiday. So it's, a barbecue and everybody kind of goes out and celebrates and has like a family day. Whereas in New Zealand, so it's the same event for the same, the same people in the same unit, as it were. It is more of a kind of November the 11th, more somber occasion. Now, that is anecdotal evidence. If there's anybody here from Australia or New Zealand, please do confirm that to me, whether I've been misinformed. But it just shows that these are two nations that are celebrating the same day that do so in different ways. So I think it is just really, and that's where being broad and doing your research comes into it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wrote a piece on the World War One in video games a few years ago, actually, and started from the idea that sort of Australian and New Zealand and British and American remembrance and French remembrance would be very similar of World War One, and then exactly like you said, found all these huge differences that I'd kind of had to question my own assumptions, my own cultural assumptions, and found it wasn't such a big part of popular memory in America as it was in the sort of Anzac context or the British context. So that was a really good point. I wonder if you could talk about this as well, Ylva, because quite a few of us have pointed to the fact that these strategy games have a tendency for multiplicity, but they're very, very open kind of narrative structures, and they leave a lot to the players. But of course, there's still these kind of embedded logics that are unchangeable no matter what the player does. So is it possible for these kind of games, based on your work with the Paradox games, to offer competing narratives? Is that something that you think can work within that structure, or is it something that needs a different kind of game structure?
I mean, I think it's certainly possible. I wonder if they're currently doing it, though. I would say, well, at least for Europa Universalis 4, for example, which is the sort of early modernity game from early 1400s to 1820 something. It's divided into eras, so the sort of the base rule sets change slightly over time as you play, but it's still based very much on a Eurocentric history. And this is also something that I discussed with the developers, and I asked them for specific examples of, for example, the trading system in that game, at least at the time, was very sort of monotonous in the sense that you could only actually trade goods coming to Europe, never the other way around. And they said that this is specifically because we use the example of Venice as a blueprint for how every trade system should work in the entire game. So ultimately you end up with this extremely singular narrative in that specific mechanic. And it's, of course, it can be modded, which is something that players then do on their own and have done. But it's so strictly in the base game that you get from the developers. This is not something that you can change. So that's one example of how that works. And even in counterfactuals, I've found, at least in most of the examples that I've studied, that, again, the counterfactuals are, they're creative, but at the same time, they're also using other historical events. And in doing so, they also recreate this European-centric colonialist idea. For example, there is one scenario in EU4 where you can play as the Aztec, and then you take over the European technology in order to then invade Europe. So in a sense, what they're trying to do is sort of move the power to basically the opposite of what actually happened. But in doing so, they also perpetuate this notion that, you know, the European technology is superior. It's, you know, which in and of itself maybe is not that controversial, but at the same time, it's not a very nuanced way of doing it. So not necessarily, but I think, of course, there is the possibility to, like Javier was also talking about, that there is this, like, can we move, you know, the goalpost for what creativity and innovation in game design can actually be? Then I think there's a lot of possibility to doing that, and I have great hope. But it's definitely something to watch out for.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because that kind of that's kind of the earliest debate that historical game studies had. You know, the sort of meaning of civilization. You know, is it actually this kind of sort of transgressive to allow oppressed people to be the colonizers, or does it just perpetuate the sort of colonialist logics? And I think there's arguments to be had in both ways. You know, that opening up that sense of, as Tom Appley's pointed out, that getting rid of that sense of teleology of the inevitability has some kind of sense of competing narratives by implication, but it's not as explicit as it could be.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we've got time for Javier to sort of say something about this. Obviously, your game very much deals with the sort of competing narratives, given the sort of history you're looking at. So maybe you could say something about that before we wrap up.
Absolutely. Since software is completely flexible, we can either stay away from controversies, as many of my colleagues do, or we can take it as one of our strengths. In our case, naturally, we go to the latter. We question it. So when there are different narratives about it, we can first understand what is important, interesting, exciting for us as developers. If we don't have one version of events that is exciting for developers, something can happen, and that is burnout. If I am imposing on all of our teammates, like many big studios do, hey, we will do this kind of story. I don't care what kind of story you want to tell. This is, as director or as writer, the one that we're going to tell. Yeah, you can get quality games out there, Red Dead Redemption 2. But developers suffer. They don't go home. There's a lot of, sadly, problems in production that happen when you are imposing a vision. So one way first is to have something that is shared with the team. Naturally, with us, it happens because many of our teammates are Mexican, but some of them are from everywhere, from Romania, currently one in Finland, many other countries in Africa. So this makes a far richer thing, because first in the team, we question, hey, is this true about the Aztecs? Hey, what I asked the team, what would be interesting for you to say about the Aztecs? And I, as a writer, find a way in order to make it, well, logical, cohesive. After that, I have a very, I don't know, Mexican viewpoint. I don't care about something that I usually listen from my American colleagues, and they fear appropriation. Oh my God, if I depict this in my game, am I appropriating another culture? What if I do it wrongly? And they get scared so easily. So as a Mexican, and many of my Mexican friends, we don't worry that much about it, but because we see it as the rising tide takes all boats. We first need to depict civilizations, the Mexica, the Aztec, the Mayas. Just by depicting them, that is first a victory. After that, naturally, we can have the nuance. A good example is Pixar with Coco, the movie. It is terrible that Americans had to make the one movie about our tradition, Dia de Muertos. Still, it gets everyone to talk about it, everyone gets to know about it, and later on we can possibly make more movies about it because there is a very good business case. People care about this. That is the main limitation for games we've made. Are people interested about this? So the more that people explore different narratives, hopefully with taste, it actually improves everyone being capable to do more depictions of this.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really interesting point, that we sort of forget that every history has its own history in popular consciousness, and sometimes it needs to be a part of the discussion before we can sort of maybe get the sort of depiction we want. It needs to be a part of it at all. Okay, yes, so all that remains really is to say thank you very much to our speakers. You've all been fantastic. You've given us really different perspectives, all very insightful, and really raised some interesting questions and made our first event hopefully a success. So thank you very much for that. To our audience, I would say we have our next call for our next theme, which will be on ethics. So this time we're moving to look at the ethics surrounding representation in historical games. And we will have 3 more guest speakers for you and another quarterly event in a few months' time. In the meantime, we also have an open call on this ethics theme, and anyone can submit an idea or a blog post to do something for our website. So we encourage the audience to go and look at our ethics theme on our website and submit anything if you'd like to sort of talk about that and get the discussion going for us. So yeah, just one more time, I'd say thank you very much to our guests. You've all been great. And I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything. Or are we done? I think.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting.
It's good. Okay.
It was super interesting. We have to have more meetings like this, more calls.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully, we'll have many more with the Historical Games Network. So, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to our speakers for giving us such a great discussion. Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.